everyone. This is John Daly from BernardGoldberg.com. We are going to do something a little bit different for today's No BS Zone podcast. Bernie was recently a guest on the Reagan Caucus podcast, which I happen to co-host, to talk about the 25th anniversary of his iconic book, Bias. Yes, it has been 25 years, and I thought the interview was so good and insightful that I asked the Reagan Caucus Action group for permission to run it here on this podcast, and thankfully they agreed. So today's No BS Zone is brought to you by Reagan Caucus Action, which you can learn more about at reagancaucusaction.org. We interview a different guest every week, and we would love for you to check us out over there. So let's go ahead and get to this interview with Bernie. You'll notice that we covered a few topics that were covered in his previous No BS Zone, just because it was, we filmed this for a different audience, but we got into a lot of things we haven't talked about in a while, and in some cases, Bernie, I don't think, has talked about in years. So it's a pretty good episode, so I think you're going to like it. Enjoy it. Hi, everyone. This is John Daly here with our special guest co-host Cliff Smith for another episode of the Reagan Caucus podcast. Our guest today is someone I'm very familiar with. I've been part of his media empire for years at BernardGoldberg.com. He is a 14-time Emmy Award-winning journalist who spent almost 30 years at CBS News before moving on to long stints at both Fox News and HBO's Real Sports. His iconic best-selling book, Bias, is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, believe it or not. I'm, of course, talking about Bernie Goldberg. Bernie, thanks for joining the two of us today on the Reagan Caucus podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate you having you on, Bernie, especially considering how sick you have to be of me by now. You know, we've been working together for about 15 years, believe it or not. Some would say that's too long. So I really appreciate you taking this extra time for me.
I'm never going to be sick of you, and I've dubbed you the Renaissance Man of the Rockies, which is a good title because that's what you are, John.
I appreciate that, and it's a title I embrace, Bernie. So, well, I mentioned as I mentioned in the intro, this is the 25th anniversary of your book, Bias, which exposed, from an insider's perspective, just how big of a problem liberal media bias had become in the mainstream, including at the network you called your home for so many years, CBS. But this whistleblowing you did, it didn't actually begin with that book in 2001. It actually began about 5 years earlier in 1996. That's when you wrote that famous op-ed for the Wall Street Journal that sent shockwaves through your profession. Bernie, can you talk about that piece a bit and what led to you writing it?
Yeah, it really, and I may be only being a bit dramatic. It touched off the media equivalent of World War III. I was a correspondent at CBS News and wrote about liberal bias, both at CBS News and in the mainstream media in general. I believe I was the only one at the time and still who wrote about bias while still employed by a major news organization. I didn't wait until I left to do it. I was a correspondent at CBS News and wrote about liberal bias. The result was I became radioactive. A lot of my friends didn't want to be seen with me. Dan Rather said, when I called him in advance, one day in advance, to tell him I was writing a piece for the Wall Street Journal. And he said, and these are his exact words, Bernie, we were friends yesterday, we're friends today, we'll be friends tomorrow. What did you write? I told him what I wrote, and he hasn't uttered a single syllable to me from that day in 1996 until now. I stayed with CBS News for, as you said, John, for about 5 more years, and then I wrote Bias.
Now, I think it was interesting this is obviously something you had seen for a while before you had written the piece.
Yeah.
This culture behind the scenes, and what I think was sort of the catalyst to get you to really write that piece, wasn't it? It had to do with Steve Forbes when he was running for president. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Wall Street Journal piece wasn't about a sexy subject. It was about Steve Forbes' campaign in 1996. He was running for president, and he was running on a flat tax platform. And CBS News had a correspondent, Eric Engberg, who has passed away, and he was working with a very liberal producer. And they did a piece that just flat out made fun of Steve Forbes. It was just a mockery of Steve Forbes. I didn't see it. I got a call from a guy named Jerry Kelly, who had helped repair my house in Miami after Hurricane Andrew. He was so Southern, he made Gomer Pyle sound like Laurence Olivier. But he was plugged into the news, and he called me up and he said, "Did you see what they did on that reality check story today?" I said, "No, I wasn't home tonight." He said, "Well, go see it." Next day, I went into the CBS News Bureau in Miami, got a tape, could not believe what I saw, went to my typewriter, and my fingers typed an op-ed. It took me as long to write it as it did to type it. I mean, I had enough of complaining privately, which I had done for more than a decade. Nobody paid any attention. They were polite, they listened, but nothing ever came of it. And I said, I've had enough. I wrote the op-ed, sent it up to the Wall Street Journal. They said, we're going to run the op-ed on Tuesday. I said, be prepared to run my obituary on Wednesday. Dan Rather wanted me fired. I know that for a fact.
Oh.
And I think the reason I wasn't fired is because Michael Jordan saved me. Not that Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan was the CEO of Westinghouse, which owned CBS at the time. And Michael Jordan gave an interview to a magazine in which he essentially said, Bernie Goldberg was onto something. A lot of people in our audience feel the way he does. Well, if the CEO of the parent company is on my side, it would have been a tough move for them to fire me. So I stayed with CBS, as you said, John, for 5 years. It was a rough 5 years. I was on several primetime shows, but Dan Rather would have nothing to do with me. And a lot of my former friends would have nothing to do with me. And when they came up with the show 60 Minutes 2, it was word around CBS it was a no-brainer that I should be on the show. But I wasn't. They passed on me. They called me up. The executive producer called me up and said, I'm not picking you for the show. And I said, okay, hung up the phone, picked up and called the president of CBS News a second later and said, I quit. And I quit. And I waited until my pension would kick in, which was in 2000. And I quit in July of 2000. Started writing Bias, which came out at the end of 2001.
Yep, and it changed a lot of things. For not so much we'll talk about that in a lit. Not so much in the media culture because that continued on, but I think it really so many people resonated with that book, and I still see people online today talking about how it really opened their eyes in a way that hadn't happened before. You know, a lot of people understood just from their own experiences watching the news that this bias existed, but to hear it laid out in such an airtight thesis as you put out there from an insider's perspective really changed a lot of perceptions. I wanted to go ahead and bring Cliff Smith into the conversation for some questions on the book. Go ahead, Cliff.
Can I briefly say, John,
Yeah.
that it opened a lot of eyes in the general population, but it didn't open any eyes in the mainstream media.
Which is really what you intended the book to do, or you were hoping the book would do.
It was a wake-up call. It was a warning, and they pay attention. Let me just read one thing before you ask me whatever you want to ask me. This is from Bias, and this is before page 1 in the book, it's a quote from Stephen Brill, who was a journalist and a lawyer. And it said, when it comes to arrogance, power, and lack of accountability, journalists are probably the only people on the planet who make lawyers look good. That pretty much sums it up, I think.
Well, very good. That's a good transition because I think Cliff is a lawyer, actually. So,
Yeah, no, it's funny you say
No
that because
offense, Cliff.
I am both a lawyer and at least some kind of journalist. I mean, I sort of freelance do at least opinion journalism, so I seem to be the least trusted person in America. But it is what it is. Anyway, that said, I want to say I read your book roughly 25 years ago, sometime in the year or so after it came out.
Thank you.
And I'll be honest, it wasn't until John asked me to do this that I had opened it up again and I looked it over again. And I was honestly shocked browsing it again what big of an effect it had on me. There were parts of it that I remembered all these times later that I didn't know where I had read it. I didn't know where it come from, but something that had really stuck with me. For example, you talked about bias being biased. And you said, hey, look, I really want non-biased news. I don't want someone saying, affirmative action, a program no sane person supports. You don't want them that. That's bias too. It's just not the kind of bias that you're concerned about because you didn't think that was happening. I think that was accurate. So I guess where I'm going with this is I think it clearly had a profound effect on a lot of people that read it. It certainly did for me. I mean, I remembered so many parts of it browsing it again, parts of it that really burned into my brain. However, and this is just sort of a big picture observation, it strikes me, and I'm just curious how you respond to this. The legacy media that you were critiquing didn't respond well to it, clearly.
Yeah.
And yet, the critics on the right, largely, it seems to me, have responded by creating some of the same mirror image problems in their universes.
It's a very good point.
And I wonder, how would you have anticipated? How could they have acted differently, I suppose? What would you have hoped they would have learned that they didn't?
That I was speaking out against bias. At the time, liberal bias was the dominant bias because it was in CBS, ABC, NBC, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and all that. Cable wasn't a factor back then.
Yeah.
But then cable came along, and cable catered to niche audiences, Fox to conservatives, CNN to liberals, and MSNBC to progressives, or MS Now, whatever it is today. The right learned nothing from my book, just as the left learned nothing from the book. The book was about, let's not have bias. Let's not have preferred positions on anything. I'll tell you my personal bias. I'm pro-choice in my personal life, but I don't want stories to have a pro-choice tilt. I'm for affirmative action in certain cases, for economic reasons, for instance, but I don't want affirmative action to be the preferred position. And the left didn't like any of that because they have a liberal bias, and I was against the liberal bias. The right, years later, Cliff, as you correctly point out, comes along in cable news and in podcasts and all that, and they're as biased as the left. They learn nothing from what I was saying. They would have made me, I'll exaggerate slightly, they would have elected me president of the United States if they had the power to do it. But now, and John knows this because he follows social media far more than I do, I've been called a liberal hack because I've criticized conservatives. I pointed out conservative bias. That made me, I'm laughing because it's so stupid. That made me a liberal hack. So liberals didn't understand what I was saying, or they understood and disregarded it. It was a wake-up call. It could have helped them a lot. They chose not to pay attention to it. And conservatives who were making me their hero learned nothing from it either. Good
Uh,
point, Clip. Good point.
Yeah, so on that topic, another part that I remembered very strongly from your book when I went back over it was when you talked about this to Dan Rather. He responded by saying how he joined up with the Marines twice and what a patriotic American he was, and that he was sort of incapable of understanding that, saying that he had political biases wasn't the same thing as calling him an unpatriotic American. It wasn't an attack on his identity or his service. And it seems to me that not only in the media, but in our political discourse writ large, those kinds of reactions, which to me seemed almost ridiculous when you described them when I read your book 25 years ago, have almost become the normal reactions to being criticized, to call it to some larger identity rather than to speak to the point. I just wonder, is there any way out of that?
Another good point, Clip, that you made. We've become so hyper polarized that everybody chooses a team and then defends everything the team does, even and if the other team does the same thing, they criticize it. So do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Okay. So if Fox News criticizes something Joe Biden did, fair enough. But when Donald Trump does essentially the same thing, they ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
And CNN is just as guilty on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any way out of it, you ask? Not anytime soon, I'm afraid, because everybody is locked in to their positions.
Mm-hmm.
They're not locked into any principles. And John Daly has spoken very intelligently about this. They're not, people aren't principled anymore, by and large. The people we're talking about, they're not principled. They've chosen a team. They defend the team. The other team is bad, no matter what. Their team is good, no matter what. And when the other team does exactly what their team does, they criticize the other team and praise their team. There is no principle involved. It is hypocrisy. And I'd say I'm depressed about it. I was at one point, but I'm beyond depressed. I say, I can't do anything about it. They don't want to do anything about it. The political polarization, to me, as far as I'm concerned, is the biggest single problem in America, much bigger than climate change or anything like that. Almost as big a problem as the national debt, which will explode one day.
Mm-hmm.
Polarization has turned Americans against each other. And that's a huge, huge problem. And I don't think the people on either side, certainly not the fringes, they don't see it, but it's becoming more and more to the middle that they don't see it either.
That actually, if I could jump in real quick, that actually teed up a question I was going to ask about. Just because it has a relevance here. Bernie, there's a chapter in Bias called "How Bill Clinton Cured Homelessness," where you discussed how homelessness was a big news media topic during the Reagan era. I've actually seen old video clips of you yourself covering the issue for CBS News back in the 1980s. But then once Bill Clinton became our president, the problem didn't go away, but the reporting of it decreased significantly. Journalists weren't as interested in spending time on it. And it seems, I was going to ask you initially when I was writing up some notes for this episode, if you thought there were some big issues today that you've noticed that same sort of thing with, where the coverage is kind of dependent on which party is in power. But that's almost more the rule now than the exception, right? It seems like there are certain issues. There are very few issues that both sides will cover with the same amount of seriousness. Am I wrong about that?
Well, no, you're not. I watch Fox and CNN to go back and forth, see what's going on. And I do it in real time. In other words, I'll watch Fox and then switch over to CNN. It's as if there's two different Americas. Fox will ignore. By the way, Fox does a good job exposing what the left is doing wrong. Fox exposed every day during when the southern border was wide open. Fox was all over it. Here's a good example of what you're talking about, John. Fox was all over it. Great video, great reporting. If you were watching CNN, you wouldn't know the border was open. I mean, there's an example right there. And in the other direction, you watch CNN and you see great reporting on crazy ass things, excuse my language, crazy things that Donald Trump just did. And then I switch back over to Fox, and they didn't even report about it. I'll repeat what I said at the outset of this response. It's if you watch that kind of media, it's as if there are two Americas out there, and Fox is covering one of them, and CNN and MSNBC are covering the other one, and they're doing it for the most cynical reasons. This is about money. They're catering to a particular audience. When I wrote about bias at the networks, there was no conspiracy to slant the news. As I said many times, Dan Rather or Walter Cronkite never came in, summoned their top lieutenants to the office, pulled the shades, doused the lights, gave the secret handshake and the secret salute, and said, how are we going to get those rotten conservatives today? How are we going to get Republicans today? It never, ever happened. No matter what conservatives think, it never happened. The problem was groupthink. You put a lot of liberals in the newsroom, you're going to get a liberal slant because they don't think they have a liberal bias. They think what they're reporting is reasonable, moderate, and mainstream. They don't recognize their bias. Here comes cable. Bias was built into the business model. Give the people what they want. Don't surprise them with something they don't want to hear. Make them come back. So Fox gives you this one kind of red meat. CNN gives another kind of red meat. Bias is built into the business model. That wasn't the way it was when I wrote Bias about the networks. That problem was groupthink. This problem is planned out. It's intentional.
No, I think you're right. I'll go ahead and give back to Cliff. I kind of intercepted your line of questioning there. Go ahead, Cliff.
Well, it's somewhat related, I suppose. I was just curious, given the fact that, as you point out, neither the legacy media nor the sort of the conservative backlash to legacy media is really interested in doing much of anything to correct the problem, best I can tell. How important do you think small organizations and small media outlets like the Reagan Caucus podcast, like your website, like the Dispatch, like some of these other, how important are they in trying to preserve or trying to change the direction of media or public opinion overall?
Speaking from my own experience, very difficult, because getting a big audience is not easy.
Mm-hmm.
I was on a show once with Connie Chung, and she said to Newt Gingrich's mother, just between us. Well, there were 3 cameras on the thing, 20 lights all over them. I mean, any reasonable person would know that just between us didn't mean just between us, right? Yeah. Just between, but Newt Gingrich's mother was an elderly woman, and it hit the fan. And our show got canceled. But when it got canceled, we had 10 million viewers. 10 million views when it got canceled. By the way, 60 Minutes today has 9 million viewers. The wow. CBS Evening News has 3.5 million viewers, okay? Jeez. I can't get an audience. I tell John this all the time. We can't get a big enough audience to make me want to get out of bed in the morning. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the audience that we have. They're loyal, they're intelligent. I could tell that by their comments, even when they disagree with something John or I said. They're mostly intelligent. They write well, they think well, but it's not a big audience. So how can I have any kind of influence to change anything? I give my opinion. I've made clear a million times, folks, it's only my opinion. You know, sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong, I guess, but I'm giving you my honest opinion. I will never pander to you. But if I did pander, Cliff, and I'm wondering what you and John think about this, if I did pander, if I did pick a side, let's say a pro-Trump side, I have a funny feeling the audience would be much bigger. What do you think, John?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I have seen a lot of very untalented people enjoy a lot of views, a big audience, just by pandering, just by treating Donald Trump as royalty. That people there is a big audience for that, and just something else I've noticed, Bernie, with the website
By
over the
the way,
years.
by the way,
Mhm.
I can't do it. It's not because I'm better than anybody else. My DNA just won't let me do that. I'm an forgive me for saying this about myself. I'm an honest journalist, and even opinion journalism has to be fair, and that's what I try to do. And I do it at the expense of my own website. I mean, it's a small website that caters to intelligent, reasonable people. But if I wanted to cater to stupid, unreasonable people, I'd have a much bigger audience.
Well, we made this joke, but if you had when you had this large audience on Fox when you were on the O'Reilly Factor every week, 3 million people. But if you had continued during the Trump era down that road that so much of the network did, you can talk about Pete Hegseth, someone like that. Bernie, you could have ended up being like the head of the CIA if you had gone full Lou Dobbs and just praised Donald Trump nonstop on Fox. The sky would have been the limit. But you do have principles, and that's what I appreciate about you. That's why I'm associated with you. I recognized that long before the Trump era, that you were never afraid to call out the right on Fox News. You weren't afraid to call out Sean Hannity on Fox News, and that
Well,
to me that said a lot about your credibility.
you want to know how stupid I am? I was getting paid a lot of money for a 5-minute segment in which Bill O'Reilly spoke for 2.5 of those 5 minutes.
For the
They sent a car to my house to pick me up. The guy opened the door for me to let me into the car. I said, don't do that anymore. Makes me feel uncomfortable. I'll open the door myself. And I am so freaking stupid that I criticized Donald Trump when I thought he deserved it. And Fox finally said, not to me. They never said why they didn't renew me, but they stopped using me long before my contract expired. And when it expired, they didn't even call to say, we're not renewing you. And you know what? I haven't had a second. I said I was real stupid. I said that to be self-deprecating, but I haven't had a second, not 1 second's worth of thought saying I should have done it differently. How can I do it differently and live with myself? Again, I'm not saying I'm better than anybody, and I hope I'm not coming off as holier than thou, but I'm just a journalist who came up in the Walter Cronkite CBS Evening News, and I can't pander to either side for an audience or for money. I can't do it.
I'm curious on a different matter, because I have mixed feelings about this myself. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of what's been going on at 60 Minutes recently with the firing of Scott Pelley. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, but this is a big subject, and I have to be careful how I say it because I want to be understood. I think Scott Pelley let's start a step before that. The new guy comes in, the new executive producer, Nick Bilton. He comes in to say, hi, everybody. Hey, I'm here to introduce myself. Scott Pelley lays into him, says he's got a slender resume. He doesn't belong here. He's going to wreck the show, and he gets fired. I think that was the right decision. Now, I spoke to a former executive producer of the show who said I could speak to him on the record. So I spoke to Jeff Fager, the former executive producer, who said something very interesting. He said, Bernie, I understand what you're saying, and here's another way to look at it. 60 Minutes is a very feisty place. His word, a feisty place. People yell at each other all the time. I spoke to somebody else who said, saying F you is the way they say good morning at 60 Minutes. That's what he said. The other person, not Jeff. It's going back to Jeff. So Jeff said, people yell at each other all the time around here, which is absolutely true at 60 Minutes. Maybe the new guy should have understood that and not been so sensitive to what Scott Pelley said. That's another position. My position, as I said, you don't say that to a new guy coming. You don't lay into a new guy coming in. I've disagreed with executive producers. I've been probably impolitic, but I never did what he did, never came close to do. Even when I wrote the piece in the Wall Street Journal, I gave Dan Rather a heads up. I gave the president of CBS News a heads up. You don't do what Scott Pelley did. I think he deserved to be fired.
Interesting. So speaking just about 60 Minutes as well. So you've long been, Bernie, a proponent of intellectual and ideological diversity in the news media. The news profession has long prioritized things like ethnic diversity, gender diversity, but not as much like a diversity of views. And that was sort of what you wrote about, a lot of bias. There was a rumor earlier this month that turned out not to be true, that podcaster Joe Rogan was being considered to replace Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes. That would certainly, of course, bring some diversity of thought to that program, but it would also seem a bridge too far. Joe Rogan is not a journalist. He is not always a purveyor of factual information. He's kind of a conspiracy guy at times. Bringing him into a serious news institution would run the risk of turning that institution into something more resembling, cable news. Do you worry though, Bernie, that even though this particular incident wasn't true, that because of the success of the cable news model and the podcast model, the big ones, serious news institutions may indeed eventually drift in that direction?
Well, first, I want to take issue with your calling it running the risk. If Joe Rogan went to CBS News, they would turn it into the building into a garage, and put it'd be closed down. It would be the end of CBS News. The only reason there isn't a mass exodus right now from CBS News over the whole Scott Pelley thing and Barry Weiss, who was brought in to run CBS News. The only reason there hasn't been a mass walkout is people have mortgages, people have bills to pay, people have kids who they want to put in college, and that's expensive. But there is mass, unbelievable unhappiness at CBS News right now. And if you want more about that, I could tell you what the single reason is. But going back to your question, I think those CBS, ABC, and NBC, which are ideas whose time has come and gone, will remain pretty much what they are. Slanted to the left, at least ABC and NBC. With Barry Weiss, they're trying to bring it to the middle. But I don't see them going the way of the podcast and all that. I think my concern about all that, John, is that regular folks that I know who watch Fox all day, or I have good friends who watch Fox, not all day, but that's their source of news. And I have good friends who are uber liberal who would never watch Fox and watch MSNBC and CNN all day. My concern is that they don't understand what they're watching, that they don't get it, that they think, the Fox people think, oh yeah, I heard that on Fox. And then I say to them, do you know about the other side of the story? And the people on the hard left, who's a neighbor of mine, a very nice guy, but hard left. You mentioned Fox News to him, and he practically has a stroke. My concern is that regular folks who have other jobs, who watch the news, but they don't understand how it's put together and all that, that they think they're getting the straight scoop, and all these podcasts and all are being subscribed to by people who want that particular point of view. The hard right podcasts liberals aren't going to pay money to listen to that stuff, and it's the truth the other way around. I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried anyway.
No, you did, and I'm glad, because this kind of goes back to that theme you talked about earlier, where it's two different worlds, and we see, Bernie, you and I see evidence of that. When we read the comments, the people that respond to the columns we put out there, I'm always sort of amazed. So I don't really watch cable news anymore. I've been upfront about that. I get my news from different sources. Some conservative, some lean left. I'm always kind of interested in getting a good mix. But I'll write a column that I assume people are going to know facts that I talk about in that column, that they will at least be aware of it, because I feel like they've been reported enough where it wouldn't catch anybody by surprise. And I am always surprised that people will push back. I've never heard about what you're saying at all. What are you talking about? And it's because we have a center right audience on the website. Fox News never reported it. Newsmax never talked about it. And so it's kind of a challenge, because they kind of think that I'm just making this stuff up at some time. So I try to be careful and add links to everything I put. But if they haven't heard about this story or this part of the story, they assume it's sort of coming from a leftist perspective, because that must be something the fake news lefties came up with. That it's a constant challenge, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing that I'm talking about.
Can I tell you my favorite reaction to something I wrote?
Sure.
You're a Jew, but Jew was spelled. I'm not making this up. John, send it to me. I'm not making this up. JOOOO. There were 5 O's.
And probably some exclamation points at the end.
I mean, if you say something some people don't like, they go to that response. You're a Jew. If they said you're a Jew with JEW, I'd say, okay, fine. But 5 O's after the J, come on. My response would be, if I'm a Jew with 5 O's, you're an idiot.
That's right. But Bernie, I get called anti-Semitic stuff all the time, and I'm Irish, so it's a crazy world we live in.
Well, that's another thing. And when my website started, my son, who's a tech person, created the website, and I told him I wanted to, and it was for free, and I had I had like 20,000 people reading everything I did. That's a big number in the small world of websites. And I wanted to hear from people, their response. So there was a way, all they had to do was hit a button and they could respond. The hatred.
Yeah.
I mean, the hatred was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And whatever it was before Donald Trump, it was amped up tenfold after Donald Trump. I mean, just hatred, visceral, nasty. Hatred is an understatement, now that I think of it. And it was always out there. But until people had a way to express it, it was sort of just, maybe they'd say it to a friend or something. But now they could say it to the whole world. And finally, I told my son, "This is crazy." He said, I'm on, however you undo that." So I no longer heard from anybody, And the religious right, they were the craziest. I said something on O'Reilly, which was taped, about how the Earth is not 6,000 years old. Sorry, folks, it isn't. It's 4.5 billion years old. It's just I didn't make that up. It's just a scientific fact. So I go home and I have my computer and I'm watching. The second I said that, Cliff, the second I said that, the hate mail started coming in on my computer, on my lap, while I'm watching myself on the TV in front of me. They have access to say whatever they want. Now, you could say we've democratized opinion and given people who had no voice a voice. There's something to be said good about that. But let's be honest. A lot of people had no voice. Now they have a voice. But
Yeah.
they also have a voice to be racist, sexist, anti-Jewish, anti-John Daly, who isn't even Jewish. You know, I mean, that came along with the technology of giving them a voice.
I think that it's a problem to encourage people to have conversations that aren't interested in good faith conversations. We used to have gatekeepers that tried to ensure something resembling a good faith conversation, and all those gates, or not all of them, but a whole lot of those gates have been torn down, and we're living with the results.
Exactly.
Yeah, do you there and there, it's really a sort of a nuanced topic because I know you've talked a lot about how a few decades back we had the biggest, we had three networks, that were putting out these evening news channels, and there were good things about that and there were bad things about that. And like you say, the good things about that, they were gatekeepers, there were standards. The bad things about that, a lot of voices were suppressed that shouldn't have been suppressed. Do you think we were better off, Bernie, in the previous era when most people got their news from these very small number of liberally biased news organizations, or are we better now that there's more voices but a lot of less responsible ones?
I know that nostalgia isn't what it used to be. And it's easy to be nostalgic and say those were the good old days. But I think the answer to your question, at least from my point of view, is yeah, it was better. It was better then. There were gatekeepers. There was a liberal slant, but you can go in, as I did, and complain about it. Now, nothing was done about it, but it got into their head. You know what I mean? And now at CBS News, and I'd like to talk about what the real angst at CBS News is about, if I
Please
could.
do. Please do.
But at CBS News, they brought somebody in. They brought somebody in who, in her view, recognized a bias. They're accusing her of inserting a bias into CBS News. Somebody said to me, "That's Rich. The bias she's bringing in, if it's a bias, is to counter the bias that you wrote about in the book Bias." So if she's bringing in any bias at all, it's to counter the liberal bias. But anyway, I do think it was better then because it was a very serious group of people. They were they were real journalists, and you didn't do something blatantly biased. The bias was nuanced compared to cable TV, for instance, where the bias is not nuanced at all. It's absolutely if you miss it, it's because you're in a coma. You're not paying attention. So in my view, and again, I know nostalgia isn't what it used to be. I would prefer the old way. Yes, I would, to what we have now. If I could mention one thing about the 60 Minutes CBS thing.
Sure.
It all comes down to one thing. There's a ground zero in all of this. And the one thing is there's a fear It may be real, it may not. I think it's too soon to tell. There's a fear that Barry Weiss and her new guy at 60 Minutes will turn CBS News into the Donald Trump television network. That's the fear. That is why almost everybody at CBS News is angry right now. At 60 Minutes, Jeff Fager told me his word, they're freaking out. And they're all worried that Barry Weiss is going to change everything and make it a Donald Trump network. Now, one person said to me, I don't believe in conspiracies, he said, but I want to throw out this conspiracy, which I might believe in. And the conspiracy he threw out was this: Donald Trump didn't like 60 Minutes, or doesn't like 60 Minutes. Donald Trump doesn't like Scott Pelley. Donald Trump doesn't like Stephen Colbert. Pause. Stephen Colbert is gone. Scott Pelley is gone. And 60 Minutes has a new executive producer. So he said, I don't like to believe in conspiracies, but that's one I might believe in. In other words, the new company, Skydance Media, that bought Paramount CBS, which is a parent company of CBS News. Maybe the goal was to make CBS News more friendly to President Donald J. Trump. Now, that's possible. And if that's the case, I'm with all the people at CBS News who are very upset and angry. But I don't know that that's the case. I haven't seen examples of that yet. You know, Scott Pelley, let me read you one thing Scott Pelley said, which is very telling, I think. Give me just a half a second.
Sure.
Okay, Scott Pelley said in his farewell letter, he said, they instructed me, this is a quote, instructed me to inject falsehoods and bias into a politically sensitive story. If that's true, that's a gangbusters accusation and a gangbusters revelation. And something big must be done about it. But you know what? He didn't tell us what story that was. He didn't tell us anything besides you don't make an accusation of that consequence without saying so-and-so told me, and this was a story that it was about. So I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if he's making it up. I'm not accusing him of that, but I am saying unequivocally, you can't make an accusation that big and not back it up.
Is it possible there's and you would probably know more about this than I would, Bernie, but like a non-disclosure sort of situation where he couldn't say exactly what he was talking about, or would that prevent him from even saying what he said?
No. And I'll tell you one other thing. There's a theory floating out there that Scott Pelley may have figured, well, these new guys are going to fire me anyway, so I might as well go out as a martyr. I might as well do suicide by cop. You know what that is, right?
Yeah.
So he said, I don't know if this is true, but this is the theory floating around out there. He says something that he knows is going to get him fired. And it does get him fired. And you know what? He becomes a hero.
Yeah, could be. Clip, did you have a question? I wanted to give you another opportunity to ask a question before we wrap things up.
No, I think that about wraps it up for me. I mean, I just will say, I guess, that I think that Mr. Goldberg's book, Bias, was a very important book and proved prophetic. The only problem is sometimes a prophet being true is not necessarily a good thing. I think we've seen the fact that his prophecy was accurate and it was not heeded, like prophets often aren't.
What I did, Cliff, is I caught up with half of the American people, and the other half didn't want to hear about it and didn't pay attention to it and didn't know it was a wake-up call, and they're suffering the consequences.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you, John, if you could just make a pitch for our website?
Yeah, I was just going to do that. So first, I was going to thank you, Bernie, for coming on the Reagan
Oh,
Caucus podcast. And
don't thank me. I enjoyed every second of this.
excellent, and I can tell you did. It's this is such a. I always think these are informative conversations when we talk about these things, but yeah. So people, in addition to the insight you provided to today, people can get more of your regular insight, including exclusive content over at bernardgoldberg.com. A premium subscription is actually only $25 right now for the month of June. So that's a huge bargain. You get all kinds of stuff for that.
Hold on.
And
You made it sound like it's $25 for the month of June.
oh no,
It's
$25 for the entire year. The sale only lasts June. If you sign up in June, you get the $25 a year annual subscription. Sorry for the confusion there, folks. But Bernie, we would love to have you back on the podcast sometime in the future if you're interested.
anytime. And Cliff, I enjoyed your questions. They actually made me think, which I don't do very often anymore.
I don't think that's
No, seriously, I've been asked a lot of usual questions, but you guys asked me questions that I haven't thought about before, and I appreciate that.
Absolutely, and I want to thank you too, Cliff, for subbing for Thomas today. You've done it before, and we'll hope to have you do it again in the future if it's something you're interested in. But I always appreciate you helping us out.
glad to do it anytime I can.
Excellent, excellent. And to everybody else who's watching or listening today, thanks for tuning in. If you're checking us out on YouTube, as always, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcast or some other audio platform, please like and subscribe as well. We also have a brand new Substack at ReaganCaucusAction.org that people can check out and subscribe to and get notified of all of our latest episodes. And thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next time on the Reagan Caucus podcast.